So this week's Parsha is Parshas Mishpatim, begins on page 417, the Art Scroll Sitter, that is chapter 21, verse 1 in Shemos. This, give me a second. Yeah, so it begins with the laws of a Jewish bondsman. That's a servant who is Jewish, but before that, it has a one-verse introduction. It begins, and these are the ordinances that you shall place before them. And an ordinance is usually an expression that's used for laws that are not ritual laws, really, but civil laws that govern monetary relationships between people. The laws of if someone damages someone, that they have to pay, and if somebody, let's say, borrows something, borrows money, they have to return it, and these kind of laws that govern those kind of relationships, that relationships of money. And the commentaries say that it begins, and these are the ordinances. What's the and there? And is connecting two things, conjunction. So it's going back, the previous Parsha, Parshas Yisro, ended with the giving of the Torah, the 10 Commandments. And now we have, and these are the ordinances that you place before them to tell us that just like the 10 Commandments were given to us at Mount Sinai, so these ordinances were also given to us at Mount Sinai. Don't think that these are rules that the rabbis made in order to make sure that we could live civilized amongst each other, and that we could have rules that that govern and allow us to live without fighting and disputes, and to have a working economy. These are mitzvahs on the same level that the 10 Commandments are mitzvahs. That if we treat each other right, if we treat one another right, and we pay for when we damage someone, and we pay our debts, and we're conscious of other people and how they live, and not damaging them and not hurting them, that's as much a mitzvah as any of the 10 Commandments are. And these begin with a Jewish bondsman. In verse 2, if you buy a Jewish bondsman, he shall work for 6 years. The seventh he will go free for no charge. If he arrives by himself, he shall leave by himself. If he is the husband of a woman, his wife shall leave with him. If his master give him a woman that she bears him sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall belong to her master, and he shall go out by himself. But if the bondsman shall say, I love my master, my wife, my children, I shall not go free, then his master shall bring him to the court, and shall bring him to the door, or to doorpost, and master shall bore through his ear with an awl, and he shall serve with him forever. We usually get bogged down here and end up spending like 45 minutes just on the Jewish bondsman. I would like to get to the rest of the Parsha this year, today, tonight, this week. So I would like to just pretty much skip through this. Just a few comments on it. Is that the two primary ways someone could become a bondsman is either by selling himself, meaning, let's say he became extraordinary poor, homeless, however you want to put it, he does not have the means to support himself. So one way he could get himself back on his feet and ensure that he's taken care of is to sell himself, and that means to sell himself for the work. But a Jew is never fully owned by another Jew. That with a non-Jewish slave, there's a certain level of ownership over them that is not true by a Jew. And we see one of the rules here is that he works for 6 years, and the seventh he shall go free. And so it's never permanent. Not only that, the Yovel year, the Jubilee year, also he'd go free, even if that takes place within the 6 years. And the Ramban comments on this, that this is the first of these Mishpatim, the first of these monetary laws is a Jewish bondsman. Why is that first? You think it's do not steal. If you steal, well, which is kind of in the 10 Commandments, but do not steal. If you steal, you have to pay back. Don't damage somebody's property if you do, or don't wound somebody. It starts with the laws of a bondsman. The Ramban says the reason why is because in the first of the commandments is, I am Hashem your God who took you out of Egypt. And so a Jewish bondsman is also a similar idea, that the same way that we were slaves in Egypt and Hashem took us out, and we recognized the great salvation that we had, that we were removed from bondage, so too when we own a slave, when we own somebody else's work, we have a worker who's working for us, and a bondsman is it's really a live-in worker who can't leave for a certain amount of time. So we have to be conscious of that we were in that situation. And when it's time for them to leave, we have to allow them to leave the same way that Hashem took us out of Egypt. And not only that, he says there's also a reference to Shabbos when it comes to the Jewish bondsman, that it says he shall work for 6 years, the seventh he shall go free. And that's a theme that we have throughout Jewish life, is the six of work and a seventh of rest. That we have the Shabbos, we have 6 days you shall work, the seventh day you rest. We have the Shemitah, the sabbatical year cycle, where 6 days we work the land, and the seventh year is a year of rest for the land of Israel. And we have the Jubilee year, where it's 7-year cycles. You work the land, and following that, we have the Jubilee year. And this is all a remembrance that Hashem, it's all a testimony that Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So just the laws of slavery itself, that we have to let our Jewish bondsmen free after 6 years, is a testimony that we recognize that Hashem created the world in 6 days, rested on the seventh. We haven't worked for us for 6 years and go free on the seventh year. And this is so important that in this week's Haftarah, it's on page 1156. This is for Fred. It's 1156. It's from the prophet Jeremiah, that it says that that Yirmiyah told the Jewish people that the people were lax in this law, and they were not letting their bondsmen free, that they felt they bought his service and he has to work for them forever. And they would not let their bondsmen free. And the King Tzidkiah, who was a righteous king, caused all of them to send them free. And then it says, but after that they reversed themselves and brought back the bondsman who they had set free, that the wealthy people regretted that setting them free and took them back, and they resubjugated them. And the word of Hashem came from Yirmiyah, from Hashem, saying, so says Hashem, God of Israel, I sealed the covenant with your forefathers on the day I took them out of the land of Egypt from the house of slaves, saying, at the end of 7 years, each of you shall set free his Jewish brother who will be sold to you. He shall serve for 6 years, you shall set him free yourself. But your fathers did not hearken to me, nor did they not incline my ear. That he's saying that for generations they were lax in setting their slaves free. And today you repented. But the prophet Yirmiyah calls it a covenant, that you set your slave free. Usually what we call a covenant is the most primary and the most basic of the mitzvahs, that Shabbos is a covenant between us and Hashem. And bris milah, circumcision, is the covenant. We call it the bris, means the covenant between us and Hashem. And here the prophet is saying that setting our slaves free is also a covenant between us and Hashem, that Hashem removed us from slavery to be his servants, and we have to do the same. We have to pay that forward to our servants to set them free so they could be servants of Hashem. And like we said, the same way Shabbos, which we also said is a covenant, that it testifies that Hashem created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh. So we have to, after our slaves work for us for 6 years, we would let them rest on the seventh year. Okay, then on page 419, verse 7, in Mishpatim, if a man will sell his daughter as a bondswoman, she shall not leave like the leave-taking of the slaves. If she is displeasing in the eyes of her master, who shall have her designated for himself, who should have designated her for himself, he shall assist in her redemption. He shall not have the power to sell her to a strange man, for he had betrayed her. If he had designated her for his son, he shall deal with her according to the rights of the young woman. And if he takes another in addition to her, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital relationships. So here the Torah is another kind of bondsman. This is a bondswoman, whereas the man became a slave, like we said, either by selling himself or by when if he stole something and did not have the means to repay, so the court would sell him as a slave in order to repay the debts from having stolen. This is a girl would become a bondswoman if she was sold by her father as a girl. She couldn't be sold as a very young girl. But this was again a way that people who were completely impoverished would be able to try to find a future for their children. If he was completely impoverished, he could sell his daughter as a worker, but with a few caveats, that there was an expectation that the one who bought her would marry her. So this was a kind of an introduction to the marriage, that he would sell his daughter as a bondswoman, and the person who bought her would be expected to marry her when she became an adult, and or marry her off to his son. If he wouldn't do that, he would need to set her free, and he wasn't allowed to sell her to anyone else. So the father who was selling her could be selective once again, he could be selective in who he's selling her to make sure that it would be a good shidduch. Okay, and as it says here, if he shall take another in addition to her, he shall not diminish her food, her clothing, or her marital relationship. And from here we see this isn't just by her, it's any wife, that our sages understand that these are three responsibilities that a husband has to his wife. They're contractual responsibilities that as part of a marriage, when a man marries a woman, he's undertaking that he's going to provide her with food, clothing, and marital relations, that's a contractual obligation on him by marrying. And verse 11, if he does not perform these three for her, he shall leave free of charge without payment. Okay, so now on verse 4, meaning that she doesn't have to pay anything to redeem herself, she could just go free. So on page 421, so now we're getting into the nitty-gritty of the laws of monetary relationships and damages. So it begins on verse 12 on page 421. One who strikes a man who dies shall surely be put to death, but for one who has not lain in ambush and God has caused it to come to his hand, I shall provide you a place to which he shall flee. So if one intentionally kills a person, so he is put to death. But if it's unintentional, he did not mean to kill the person, but he killed through negligence, so then he would flee to a city of refuge. And in verse 14, if a man shall act intentionally against his fellow to kill him with guile, from my altar you shall take him to die. That means that if he with malice and premeditation kills a person, so even if he would flee to the altar of Hashem, he would be taken to be killed. And our sages say that there's an implication here that if he kills with guile, he's taken from the altar. That would imply that if he did not kill with the guile, meaning that if he killed unintentionally, so the altar would be considered a city of refuge, the same way that a city of refuge is a city of refuge. So there's another category of a city of refuge, and that is the altar. And in fact, we find in the book of Malachim, the book of Kings, at the beginning, as King David is getting close to death, so he gives his last will and testament to his son, to Shlomo, King Shlomo. And in his last will and testament, he tells his son Shlomo that he should kill Yoav ben Surya, who was one of King David's generals, but he had killed another of King David's generals, or he killed another two of them, one being Abner ben Ner, who was really Shaul's general, and another one, Amasa, he killed. So, and he also sided with King David's son Adoniyahu, opposed to Shlomo. He was a complicated person, and David commanded that Shlomo should kill him. But Shlomo understood he couldn't do this, just kill this popular general. So he waited until he rebelled. He did something that was understood to be rebelling against the king. And then he sent ben Yoyada, who was to be his general, Shlomo's general, to kill him. And Yoav fled to the altar. It says that he grabbed onto the corners of the altar. And even before that, it says that Adoniyahu was another son of David who rebelled, there's a famous rebellion against King David. That was Avshalom. David's son Avshalom, who had a very successful rebellion that King David was on the run from him for a long time. But that was put down and he was killed. But later, another son of his, like we said, another son, Adoniyahu, rebelled. And this was at the end of David's life. It was less of a rebellion and more of an illegitimate succession. That David was very old and he was weak at the time. So one of his sons, Adoniah, who was an older son, decided that he was going to be king, and he gathered together many of the important Jews, and they were celebrating. And then Bathsheba, David's wife, Shlomo's mother, came to David and told him what was happening, and David found the strength to coronate Shlomo as king. So Adoniah, when he heard about this, he realized he was in trouble. So he also ran to the Mizbeach, he ran to the altar and grabbed onto the corners in order to save himself. And that was all based on this verse here, that it says that one who kills by guile, where is it? If a man acts intentionally against his fellow to kill him with guile from my altar, you shall take him to die, implies that the altar would be a refuge for somebody if they did not kill with guile, if they did not kill intentionally. Okay, so moving on in verse 15, one who strikes his father and mother shall surely be put to death. And this is meaning if one hits a parent in a way that makes a wound, so they're subject to capital punishment. The Rambam adds in that for this reason, if someone's a doctor, let's say, and their parent needs a medical procedure, and if that medical procedure would cause some kind of wound, it would cause they'd have to make an incision or something along those lines. The Rambam says they should not do it, and they should not initially do it unless they have a very good reason. Meaning that if there would be a lower prognosis, let's say, if someone else did it, so then they should definitely do it. But if there's no difference really between them doing it and someone else, they should have someone else do it. And I guess this would be relevant also. Let's say if someone's parent had a splinter or something. So if there's someone else to remove the splinter, a child should not do it because they might cause their parent to bleed, which would be, once again, which is not, as long as someone's doing it for a valid medical reason, it's okay, but it's better not to. And in verse 16, one who kidnaps a man and sells him and is found to have been in his power shall surely be put to death. One who curses his father or mother shall surely be put to death. Now in verse 18, there's an interesting verse. If men quarrel and one strikes his fellow with a stone or fist, and he does not die but falls into bed, if he gets up and goes about outside under his own power, the one who struck is absolved. Only for his lost time he shall pay, and he shall provide for healing. So now the Torah is giving us kind of qualifications for what is considered murder. Meaning, let's say someone hit someone intentionally. They threw a rock at them, they hit them with a fist. That sometimes does kill people. So the Torah is saying that if he gets up and goes about outside under his own power, that's based on the understanding of Rashi. The Ramban actually understands that to mean if he goes about while on holding a walking stick, meaning like he might need a cane, but if he's walking around outside and then he dies, even if he dies from the wound, but as long as he recovered to the point that he's walking around outside, so that is not considered murder. It's not direct enough. We can't link that to the injury enough for it to have been called murder. But if let's say the person struck him and he's bedridden because of the wound, and then he dies, even if it's after a period of time, so then the person who struck him would be considered a murderer and would be put to death. Okay, and also the verse 19 ends, only for his lost time shall he pay, and he shall provide for healing. And this is two of the things that if one person wounds another, that they're obligated to pay. That there are actually 5 things that they're obligated to pay. They're obligated to pay for the damage to the person. So if one person injures another person, they're obligated to pay for the damage. They have to pay for the pain. They have to pay for the pain and suffering. I think they call it in legalese. They have to pay for the shame that they cause, because sometimes it's embarrassing. And the 2 of them are in this verse, that they have to pay for the lost time, meaning they have to pay for the work that the person's losing because of the injury. And he has to pay for the healing, meaning they have to pay for a doctor, the doctor's bills. Another thing that our sages learned from this verse is that it says, he shall provide for healing. But this verse tells us that a doctor has permission to heal, and that one is allowed to go to a doctor. Because one could say, and this is what some believe, hopefully not amongst us Jews, but some other groups believe, that if a person's sick, if a person has any kind of ailment, that must be a punishment from God. And who are we to try to remove that? That's a situation God put us in. Some people believe that if we're injured, we have to pray on it. And who are we to tamper with God's plan? But here our sages understand from this verse in the Torah that we pay for healing. That our sages understand that the Torah is telling us that one is not only is one allowed to go to medical medical expertise to try to heal themselves, when it's obligated to do so, and when it's obligated to pay for someone else to do so if they caused any injury. That Hashem put us in this world, and Hashem gave us resources to take care of ourselves, and we have a mitzvah to take care of our bodies. So, like I said, that we don't believe, of course, we have a mitzvah to daven and to examine our deeds and to look at why Hashem would send us whatever difficulties we're going through, whatever health issues we have. But we also have a mitzvah to take care of our bodies, and that means to go for medical advice and medical treatment when it's necessary. Okay, so the bottom of page 421, verse 20. If a man shall strike his slave or maidservant with the rod, and he shall die under his hand, he shall surely be avenged. But if he will survive for a day or two, he shall not be avenged, for he is his property. Here, this is talking about a non-Jewish slave, and it's saying even if one kills a non-Jewish slave, so they are put to death, they're subject to capital punishment. Verse 423, it is the penalty for bodily injury. If men shall fight and they collide with a pregnant woman and she miscarries, but there will be no fatality, he shall surely be punished as the husband of the woman shall cause to be assessed against him, and he shall pay it by order of the judges. That he's saying that if someone kills a fetus, and this is unintentionally, he kills a fetus. But if someone causes a woman to miscarry, he's not subject to capital punishment. That's looked at as a monetary punishment. And in this case, it says that he shall be punished and they shall cause to be assessed against him. What does that mean, they cause to be assessed against him? So our sages say, the Gemara says that slavery was an institution then, and they look at the difference in her value before she miscarried and afterwards, that a pregnant slave was valuable because you have the mother and you'd own the baby afterwards. So they look at how much a slave she would be worth on a slave market as pregnant and how much she's worth following a miscarriage, and the one who caused her to miscarry would have to pay the difference. And that's how they would evaluate this. That's how they would appraise that damage. Okay, and in verse 23, but if there shall be a fatality, then you shall award a life for a life. And here the Gemara says that it looks like it's saying that he would be subject to capital punishment, but that's not what it means here. Instead, because here we said before that if someone killed intentionally, they're put to death. Here we said that he tried to strike one person, but he accidentally hit this woman. And so if it caused her to go into labor, let's say, and it caused her to die, so he would not be put to death because that would be considered unintentional, and he would have to pay for the damage. In this case, he would have to pay for the value of her life, which was something that the commentaries struggle to understand exactly how you would evaluate it, which I guess it would be how much they'd go on a slave market. I mean, how much such a person would be sold for in the slave market, and that's how much the one who killed her would have to pay. Then it continues in verse 23, but if there shall be a fatality, then, in verse 24, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth, a hand for a hand, a foot for a foot, a burn for a burn, a wound for a wound, a bruise for a bruise. So the Gemara in Baba Kama says very clearly that, and spends a long time, an extended conversation proving this, that this does not in fact mean what's generally understood, an eye for an eye, meaning that if one person blinds someone's eye, they have their own eye blinded. The Gemara says that's not the case and proves it, at length. That means that you pay the value of the eye, meaning you pay them how much that damage was worth. And like we said before, you look how much would this person go in the slave market with a functioning eye, and how much would he go now without the eye, and pay the difference. And that's how they would assess the value of this damage. And this is, like we mentioned before, there are 5 categories that a person who injured someone else would have to pay. This is the third, the damage, which is the difference between the amount that the person's value in the sense of how much he would be worth as a slave decreased. And that's how they would assess that once again. Okay, in verse 26, if a man shall strike the eye of a slave, the eye of the maidservant, they would go free. And in verse 28, now we have another principle governing relationships between people. If an ox shall gore a man or a woman and he shall die, the ox shall surely be stoned, his flesh may not be eaten, the owner of the ox shall be innocent. Because animals, as oxen, well, not every animal, but oxen, one does not have to expect that it will go and kill another person, that they're considered domesticated animals that are not dangerous unless it's demonstrated that it's dangerous. So if it kills a person, the ox is put to death, and it's considered completely off limits. You can't eat the meat. You can't use the hide. But the owner is innocent. We don't blame the owner because it's something that's expected. But if it was an ox that gores habitually from yesterday and the day before, Gemara says that means that the owner was warned that it had gored 3 times. So when its owners had been warned but did not guard it, and it killed a man or woman, the ox shall be stoned, and even its owners shall die. And here, again, the Gemara says that does not mean that he's put to death by a court. It means that's a heavenly punishment. And when an atonement payment shall be assessed against him, he shall pay as a redemption for his life, whatever shall be assessed against him. And once again, I say here, that means that they assess either how much he's worth or how much the victim was worth. That's a disagreement in the Gemara. Okay, so skipping a little bit, verse 33, if a man shall uncover a pit, or if a man shall dig a pit and not cover it, and an ox or donkey falls into it, the owner of the pit shall make restitution. So now we see that not only is a person obligated or liable for the damage that he does, that the person does, a person's liable for the damage that comes indirectly from him. And here it says if he digs a pit in a public place, but it also, our sages interpret it to mean any kind of obstacle that a person places in a public thoroughfare. So this is if a person digs a pit in the street, or let's say if a person left a bike in the street, and let's say a car hit it, damages a car, or any kind of obstacle that a person places in a public place, and it damages, they're liable for that. In verse 35, now if one's man's ox shall strike his fellow's ox, which dies, they shall sell the living ox, divide its money, and the carcass too they shall divide. So here, now we see that a person is liable for the monetary damage that his property does. So this is an ox, but it's true about any animal, any conscious being. So if a person has a dog and that dog does damage, so they're liable for the damage the dog does. And here, it's if his ox shall strike his fellow's ox which dies, they shall sell the living ox, divide its money, and the carcass too they shall divide. So here the Gemara interprets this. Once again, a lot of this is subject to interpretation, and the Gemara interprets its meaning. That here it means that, well, I'll read the next verse and then we'll come back. But in verse 36 on page 425, but if it becomes known that it was an ox that had gored habitually from yesterday and before yesterday, but its owners did not guard it, he shall surely pay an ox in place of an ox, and the carcass shall be his. So here we're saying that, like we said before, that an ox, one does not have to expect that it will cause damage. Oxen do not usually go and gore or cause damage to other animals. So if it just did it a one-time thing, so he would only have to pay half the damage. And he would only have to pay half the damage, and only up to the value of the animal that does the damage. So if you have a scrawny young ox that gores a huge, expensive, prized ox, so you would have to pay half the value of the damage that was caused, but only up to the value of the ox that did the damage. But that's only if it hadn't done it before. But if he was warned 3 times, once again, if his animal damaged 3 times and he was warned that it's a damaging animal, so then he would have to pay full price for whatever damage it did. And that's true about oxen, but animals that one could expect to do damage. So let's say if a person has a pet lion, a pet tiger, and it kills an animal, so you don't need the warnings in that case, that an animal that is expected to do damage. So, or I would actually go the opposite way. An animal that is not unexpected if it damages, So in that case, they would be liable for the full damage initially. Okay, if a man steals an ox or a sheep or a goat, slaughters or sells, he should pay 5 cattle. He pays 5 times in place of the ox, and 4 sheep in place of the sheep. So if a person steals an ox or a sheep or a goat and slaughters it or sells it, so he has to pay 5 times the value if it's an ox, 4 times if it's a sheep. And sheep is less than an ox, I sages say, because a sheep, an ox a person leads and it follows him, whereas a sheep a person has to carry it, and just the shame of having to carry it out in the street, so he has to pay a little less. Now in chapter 22, on page 427, if a thief is discovered while tunneling in, and he is struck and died, there is no blood guilt on his account. This, the Torah is telling us, a home invasion, if a person is caught during a home invasion, you can make an assumption that he's willing to kill. That he's willing to kill, and if the owner of the house kills someone during a home invasion, kills a thief during a home invasion, they are not liable, that they're exempt, because, like we said, there's an assumption that that thief would fight for his life, and the homeowner is allowed to fight for his life and to kill the person to save himself. But in verse 2, if the sun shone upon him, there is blood guilt on his account, he shall make restitution. What does that mean, if the sun shone upon him? So Rashi understands that means that if it's clear as day that the one who is doing the home invasion has no ill intent against him and will not kill him. For example, let's say a parent is caught sneaking into his child's home. Let's say the parent is desperate for money and he's stealing from his son. And they catch him, he had tunneled into his son's house, broken in. So in that case, it's clear a parent would not kill a child for money. Maybe nowadays with drug problems, I don't know if you could still say that. But there's an assumption that a parent would not kill a child. So if the child kills the parent, and knowing that it's the parent, so then they would actually be subject to punishment for having killed them. And the Ramban, though, understands this to mean if there are kosher witnesses there. So in that case, he would be punished for killing him, because the thief would not, there's an assumption the thief would not kill the homeowner if there are witnesses who would testify. He would not commit murder. He would not, because then he would be subjecting himself to capital punishment in court. Okay, so now in verse 3, if the theft shall be found in his possession, whether a live ox, a donkey, a sheep, or a goat, he shall pay double. So a thief, whatever he steals, we said before that if he slaughters it and sells it, that he pays 4 times or 5 times. A regular thief, this is somebody who sneaks in and steals. There's another kind of thief that's a robber, meaning someone who, like a strong arm robber, someone who goes to someone out in the open and says, give me your money, I'll beat you up. So that's a different kind of thief. This thief, meaning a burglar, so he has to pay double what he stole. A robber, someone who robs, a mugger, would actually pay only 1 and with a 5th penalty. And the reason for the difference is that this kind of thief, a burglar, is demonstrating that he's afraid of people, and therefore he's going secretly into the house. But he's not afraid of Hashem. He's demonstrating that his fear of man is greater than his fear of God. So he has this harsh penalty, whereas a mugger, a robber, is demonstrating he's not afraid of people either. So that's a little better, that at least he's not showing that he's more afraid of people than good. So then we have in verse 4, if a man permits livestock to devour a field or vineyard. So now we're saying that a person is responsible for their property, the damage their property causes, even if it's not their property damaging intentionally, like a dog biting or an ox goring. Here, they're just grazing in someone else's field. And so the damage, they're eating someone's tomato plants. So you're still obligated to pay for that. And then in verse 5, if a fire shall go forth and find thorns, that he's obligated. And here, the Gemara says that when a person sets a fire, the fire isn't their property. The fire there's no real substance to it. And it's not their direct damage, because the person just lit the fire in one spot. When fire spreads, it's because the wind is blowing it to cause it to spread. So one may think that it's not their direct action that's causing the damage, and still the Torah is saying they're liable. And so that's the laws of damage. And the next topic in the Parsha is the laws of a custodial relationships. That means if one person takes responsibility to protect someone else's property, and there's certain levels of, depending on how they took that responsibility, there are different liabilities. So it begins if a man shall give money or vessels to his fellow to safeguard, and it is stolen from the house of the man. If the thief is found, he shall pay double. This means that, and the Gemara explains, this is talking about a free custodian, meaning someone just accepts to watch something. Someone says, "Could you please watch my goldfish?" Or, and he says, "Yeah, sure," but you're not paying him for that. He's just doing you a favor. Or you say, "Could you please watch my house? Just could you house it?" And you're not paying the person who's doing it. So, and it's stolen from the house of the man. If the thief is found, he shall pay double, like we said. If the thief is not found, then the householder shall approach the court, and that he had not laid his hand upon his fellow's property. The person who accepted to be a custodian over someone else's property has to swear an oath that he did not use the item, because if he used it, he would be liable if it's stolen. And whomever the court finds guilty shall pay double to his fellow. But as long as he swears that he didn't use it, so he is exempt, meaning that a person who accepts the custodial, to be a custodian over a watchman, basically to protect someone else's stuff for free. So he's not, if it gets stolen or it gets lost, he's not liable. He's only liable if he's negligent. So if he doesn't watch it in a normal manner, if he's negligent, so then he'd be required to pay, but otherwise he would not be required to pay. And in verse 9, if a man shall give his fellow a donkey or ox or sheep or any animal to safeguard, and it died or was broken or was looted without an eyewitness. Now we're talking about if someone was paid to watch it. Someone hired someone else to watch to house it, to watch the stuff in their house, or they hired someone else to watch their car. So, or let's say they hired them, like, "Could you please walk my dog?" And they paid them money. So if the person's walking the dog, they're accepting to watch the dog for that time. And so let's say it gets stolen. So it died or was broken, was looted without an eyewitness. An oath of Hashem shall be between them both that they did not lay hand on the property of the fellow. Like we said, he has to swear that he did not use it. And the owner shall accept it and he shall not pay. So if it shall be stolen from him, he shall pay to the owners. But so we said before that a free watchman, if someone's watching something for free, so they do not have to pay if it was stolen. But if someone accepts to watch something for payment, then if it gets stolen or lost, they have to pay. But if it was accidental, which is a lower level of liability, let's say. So let's say they had the dog in their house and their roof caved in. A branch fell from a branch fell and caved in the roof and it died. So then they would not be liable because there's no negligence there. But if they're negligent, they're still liable. Second, but even if they're not negligent, if it's stolen or lost, they still have to pay. So now the next is a borrower. So in verse 13 is a borrower. If a man shall borrow from his fellow, that means that he's not paying. Someone else is giving him their thing to use. Let's say someone borrows a car. So the owner is allowing them to use it, and they're not paying anything for that use. So they have the highest level of liability. That it shall become broken or shall die, provided the owner is not with him, he shall surely make a restitution. So if someone borrows a car, let's say, and it gets stolen, they have to pay for the car. And if someone borrows a car and let's say a tree falls down on it, they have to pay for the car. That even if it's accidental, something that they couldn't have predicted, still a borrower has accepted almost complete liability. And if anything happens to it, they have to pay. And it continues, it ends. If he was a renter, it came in return for his rentals, which means that a renter does not have the same liability as a borrower since he's paying for it. So he's not accepting the same amount of liability as someone who's using it for free. And in fact, the halacha follows the opinion that a renter would have the same liability as a paid watchman. So meaning that they would have to pay for if it was stolen or lost, but they would not have to pay if an accident happened to it. Okay, next we have the laws of if a person seduces a virgin. So if a man shall seduce a virgin, this is verse 15 on page 429, who is not betrothed and lie with her. So if she was betrothed, that would be adultery. That's a whole different topic. Here, it's talking about a girl, and this is a girl who's bas mitzvahed, but barely. I'm sorry, my mistake. This is a girl from 3 years and up, technically, but but not in a full adult. This is up to a girl who's a full adult, which is usually could be considered 12 and a half. But if a man shall seduce a virgin who was not betrothed and lie with her, he shall provide her with a marriage contract as his wife. If her father refuses to give her to him, he shall weigh out silver according to the marriage contract of the virgins. Meaning that if she and the father want it, he's obligated to marry her. But if the father or her does not want to marry him, so then he has to pay a fine. But otherwise, that fine would actually be her ksuba. It would go towards the marriage. Okay, and as it says here, the father refuses to give her to him. The commentaries say, the Ramban brings, I think Rashi might even speak this out, that she's not obligated to agree to this. This is, if he seduces her, he has an obligation to marry her. And this is only up till that age that I gave, which I believe is 12 and a half. That from that point forward, he's not obligated in this anymore. Okay, in verse 17, let's see. Okay, so now in verse 20 on page 431, you shall not taunt or oppress a stranger, for you are strangers in the land of Egypt. You shall not cause pain to any widow or orphan. If you dare to cause him pain, for if he shall cry out to me, I shall surely hear his outcry. My wrath shall blaze, and I shall kill you by the sword, and your wives will be widows, your children orphans. That orphans and widows are people who don't have the protectors that they usually have. That usually a husband is there to protect his wife, and a father is there to protect his children. And these people are missing them. And the Torah says that Hashem, the prophets say that Hashem is Avi Yisayim V'dayin Almanas. That means Hashem is the father of orphans and the judge of widows, meaning that when a person doesn't have protectors, Hashem is their protector, and when they cry out to Hashem, Hashem answers them. So a person has to be very, very careful about causing them pain, because they have the best defender. They have the best one looking out for them. So now in verse 24, this is a new topic, and that's the topic of lending money. And it begins, when you lend money to my people, to the poor person who is with you, do not act towards him as a creditor, do not lay interest upon him. The Gemara says here that when you lend money is a mitzvah. It means thou shalt lend money. And we usually think of tzedakah. We think that, if someone comes and someone needs money, so there's a mitzvah to give him money, free money. But it may be even a bigger mitzvah if that's the circumstances dictate to lend a person money when they're in need, because they don't feel the same shame as getting free money. So, and it's a mitzvah of tzedakah just as much as giving money, that having money available to somebody to lend the money when they're in need. But it says, do not act towards him as a creditor. That means that not to dominate him, not to treat him like you owe me, so now treat me well. And our sages say that means that if you know that he can't pay, if you lend him money and he can't pay, don't even try to be around him, because he's going to see you and feel that shame. So instead, it says try to avoid him if you lent him money and he can't pay, so he doesn't feel the shame of being around you. And but at the same time, the Gemara says that when a person does lend the money, they should have the expectation of getting the money back. And there's nothing wrong with lending money in the optimal way that you can ensure that you'll get your money back. In fact, the Gemara says that it's prohibited to lend money without witnesses, because of the prohibition against putting an obstacle in front of the blind, meaning that if a person lends money without witnesses, you're putting the other person in a state of temptation to deny that it ever happened. So there's a mitzvah, actually. There's a mitzvah to, when you lend money, to lend with witnesses. And it's perfectly okay and maybe preferable that you should lend in a way that you'd ensure that you get your money back, to have some kind of security collateral, or to make sure that there's a guarantor to make sure that you get what you lent back, that there's nothing wrong with that. But once the loan is finished, that you shouldn't be overly, um, I'd like to say mean to the person that you lent it to. That once you lent the money, if he can't pay back and you don't really have a way of getting money, you can't squeeze water out of a dry rock. And so don't. And in verse 25, if you take your fellow's garment as a security until sunset, shall you return it to him? For it is alone his clothing, it is a garment for his skin. And what shall he lie down? You take his mattress, you take his blanket as a collateral to pay. Then he has nothing to, he doesn't have a blanket that night. So you have to return that at night for him to use it. Okay, let's skip a little bit. Okay, in verse 30, people of holy. Another thing I wanted to say, that the verse ends at 24. Do not lay interest upon him. That means that there's a prohibition against charging interest to another Jew. We are allowed to lend with interest to non-Jew, but it's prohibited to lend to a Jew. The commentaries say that Jews are family. That there's nothing wrong really with interest. We're allowed to rent a car. You're allowed to rent your car to someone else. You could you're allowed to have people pay for using your things. So why not money? Why can't you have people pay for using your money? That's pretty much what a loan is. It's renting your money. So it's because that we're family, and with family, one shouldn't charge them for a loan. And this has a lot of ramifications in halacha, and really anytime a person is lending money, it's probably worthwhile talking to the rabbi to make sure we're doing it right, because of this prohibition that once that we have to make sure that we're not charging anything on the way back, and charging anything for the loan. And I actually had a question on this, that I have a small amount of money invested, and the brokerage sent me a notice that they would like to lend out the stocks that I have. That's a thing that they do, that people short the stocks. They borrow stocks, sell them, expecting it to go down, and then they buy it back and return it when it's time to return it. So the brokerage said that they want to lend out the stocks, and we'll split the interest, meaning the brokerage will take some of the interest and I'll get some of the interest. And it's a way that if you have stocks just sitting there that you're saving for a long time, so you can make money off it by lending it and getting the interest. So and I realized that this might be a halachic issue, because even if the brokerage is lending out the stocks, they're mine, and they're acting as an agent for me, that the stocks belong to me and they're acting as my agent. And I don't know who they're lending it to. It very well might, and it might even, with the market, it might be likely that they're lending it to another Jew who's paying interest that's coming to me, which means that essentially I'm lending something with interest to another Jew, which would be prohibited under this. So I actually took a lot of time researching this and found the Shulchan Aruch actually. It's based on an extended Tosfos. It's an incredible, lengthy discussion in the Gemara and in the commentaries on the Gemara. But ultimately, the Shulchan Aruch makes paskins that the Shulchan Aruch decides that in such a case, it would depend on who's responsible for the money ultimately. Meaning that, let's say there's a loss in the money. Let's say the borrower defaults; he doesn't return it. So who would take the loss? That if it would be the brokerage that would take the loss. So then it's considered as if I'm lending to them and they're lending to the next party, in which case it would be permitted because the brokerage aren't Jewish. But if they're just acting as an agent for my stuff, and if the person defaults, then I would be the one on the hook. So then it would be prohibited. And in fact, I looked very closely at the terms and conditions, and they said that there's no risk in that sense for me, because they actually write in the terms and conditions that what's really happening is I'm lending to them and they're lending to the next party, so there will not be a problem. And I've mentioned this before in Shul, but there's another societal issue with this prohibition, and that is that Rocket Mortgage is owned by what's his name? The owner of the Cleveland, Dan Gilbert, who owns the Cleveland Cavaliers. He owns what's it called? Quicken Loans, which became Rocket Mortgage, which I believe is the biggest mortgage lender in the country, and he's Jewish. So anyone who would be borrowing money, getting a mortgage to Rocket Mortgage, they would be borrowing money from a Jewish company, and paying interest, which would again be prohibited by this verse.
So not an exception if it's like through a corporation or something, or is it?
So if the lender is a corporation, no. If the borrower is a corporation, maybe. So because if the borrower is a corporation, that means that there's no real person that's liable for the loan. So, but if the corporation is owned by a Jew, in this case, he owns, or at least majority owner or controlling owner is a Jew, so it is a problem. It is problematic. So many rabbis actually met with him, and they came up with a I don't want to call it a loophole, but they have a way around it. And in fact, if you look at the legal notices page on Rocket Mortgage, so they have a section for if you're an Orthodox Jew or if you're a Jew who's worried about this prohibition. So they have what's called a heter iska, which means that they have a special way of structuring the loan. That instead of being a loan, it's structured as an investment, which would not be covered by these terms. And
do lending in Israel, if the majority of people are Jewish, I mean, it would be
so all the banks there. Right, so all the banks there also would have this heter iska. They would lend within a permitted fashion, where they're not actually lending money. They're or maybe only half of it is a loan and the other half is an investment, and that's where the extra money is coming from. But with a company like Rocket Mortgage, the way they operate is they lend you the money, and then within a month or so, they sell it already to Fannie Mae, Freddie, whatever it is. They sell it to one of these like loan asset companies. So they only own it for a short time. So the terms are that for that time it's an investment, and once they sell it, it's a loan. So that's how they'd get around this. Okay. So just a few more minutes. In verse 30 on page 433, it says, people of holiness shall you be to me. You shall not eat flesh of an animal that was torn in the field. To the dog you shall throw it. That we have a prohibition against eating an animal that was torn. That means that an animal that had an injury, a certain class of injuries that's enumerated by the Gemara, so that animal is prohibited to eat. And this is actually the real term where we call something that's not kosher treif. That comes from here. The treif, if you look in in verse 30, pasuk lamed, if you look in the Hebrew, those who can, it says ubasar basada treifa lasachelu. That treifa literally means torn up, referring to this prohibition against eating an animal with significant injuries. And that's where the term treifa comes from. It kind of became a blanket term for not kosher, but it's more specifically, it's referring to this. Okay. In verse 4, on the bottom, page 433, verse 4, if you encounter an ox of your enemy or his donkey wandering, you shall return it to him repeatedly, meaning that if someone's animal, even if it keeps on getting away, you have a mitzvah to return it. This is the mitzvah of Hashavas Aveda, returning a lost object. And on page 435, if you see the donkey of someone you hate crouching under its burden, would you refrain from helping him? You shall help repeatedly with him. Here the Torah is telling you, even if you hate the guy, but it's a mitzvah to help him out if his animal is broken down at the side of the road. So then we have the mitzvah of judging properly, and the mitzvah of leaving parts of our produce for the poor, and about being careful about worshiping idols. And then on page 437 at the bottom, we have the mitzvah to make a pilgrimage to the land of Israel 3 times a year on Pesach, Shavuos, and Sukkot. And then on the bottom of page 437, verse 20, behold, I send an angel before you to protect you on the way and to bring you to the place that I have made ready. Beware of him, hearken to his voice, do not rebel against him, for he will not forgive your willful sin, for my name is within him. Here the Medrash understands that it's that Hashem is telling us that we're going to sin and lose this direct divine protection, and instead be led by an angel, by a messenger of Hashem. And the Medrash says that after the sin of the golden calf, Moshe begged Hashem not to do this, and Hashem agreed. And instead, Hashem directly led us through the desert, but that was only until the death of Moshe. But once, according to this is at least how the Ramban understands, once Moshe died, Yeshua took over. So it says in the book of Yeshua that an angel, a man came to him holding a sword, and that was an angel of Hashem, and that was the angel that's referred to here, that the angel that was going to lead us, that was the angel of Hashem sent to Yeshua to lead us in the conquest of the land of Israel. And it talks about how blessed we'll be if we follow Torah. And then on page 441, the Parsha ends on page 441, verse 1, with Hashem instructions, which according to Rashi, this actually took place before the giving of the Torah. Ramban understands that it took place afterwards. And I'll just go assuming like the Ramban, that after the Torah was after we had the 10 Commandments, so Hashem taught Moshe the Mishpatim, that all these laws in this week's Parsha, and he wrote it down in a book, and the people accepted. In verse 3, this is one of the great verses in the Torah, that Moshe came and told the people all the words of Hashem and all the ordinances, and the entire people responded with one voice, and they said, all the words that Hashem has spoken, we will do. And then he had this ritual for a covenant that he wrote the words of Hashem. They brought offerings and took the blood and sprinkled the blood on the altar and on the people. And in verse 7, he took the book of the covenant and read it in the earshot of the people, and they said, everything that Hashem has done, we will do and we will obey. This is what we call Nasa v'nishma, that the people wholeheartedly accepted to follow the Torah and study the Torah. And this was the covenant between Hashem and the Jewish people. And then the leaders of the Jewish people had this great vision of heaven. And then Moshe went up Mount Sinai and was there for 40 days and 40 nights to be taught the meaning of the Torah by Hashem. Have a great Shabbos.